All right, hello everyone, and okay. All right, hello everyone, and welcome. It is Thursday, November 12th, and we are at the end of week 3. We are at full steam right now. We have gone through and you have submitted your week 2 submissions. That was the last round of submissions from Sunday, and you are probably deep in the middle of working on your week 3 assignments. On Tuesday, we started out with a description of all of your new assignments. We talked about the new palace composition with the vertical layering, and one of tonight's topics is going to be diving into these ideas of different approaches of setting up your music. We kind of introduced the idea of horizontal resequencing and vertical layering, at least in context of your palace composition, but we'll dive into that a little bit further with more examples or more description. And now I have gone through the grades for your game composition, your production technique, and your technical assignment. Those all three have been returned back to you, and today the revision assignment has opened up, and so you have the opportunity to make any changes for that for your week 2 assignments. So I went through everybody's Angry Bots compositions, finished those up yesterday, and delivered those back to you. Had a good amount of solid projects to work with, and like most of the time, it's mostly taking what you have worked on and developing it further and just making tweaks, and maybe things were not set up appropriately for the particular cue or piece of music that they represented. So just some things overall to work on, and you will have the opportunity to resubmit those by tomorrow evening. So that will be week 2 revisions, and then your new week 3 assignments will be due Sunday, and that will get us heading into week 4. So yeah, that's pretty much where we're at. Our topics this evening are going to start discussing how the music actually works in the game, different musical approaches, taking some of the ideas that we've been working on throughout the month and applying them into a much larger context. And then we'll talk about some of the limitations that the medium of games requires. And I think I did not get to this topic last week, or I know I didn't. So we have a history of game consoles that we want to discuss. We want to talk about all of the technology and how it worked over the different generations of gaming consoles. So that is our general plan for this evening. And so where we start out this tonight is how do you take the music that you have created and developed in a project and start applying it more specifically to the game? Overall, the music starts out more as just ideas and thoughts and musical concepts, and you revise and change those ideas, and eventually they are crafted for the game itself. Early on in the process, you don't know where all of the different pieces of music are going to end up. You are writing them for different ideas and parts of the game. You know that there's going to be action, and you know that there's going to be the puzzles, and you know that there's going to be levels, and you know that there's going to be encounters with enemies, and you can, earlier on in the process, you're defining different parts of the game, and you are writing you're writing music for much more general terms. And as you build a larger and larger library of music, and as the game gets more and more developed, you are able to identify particular pieces of music for particular parts of the game, or spots in the game. So it is often revisiting pieces of music and editing them and looping them and crafting them to fit a particular part of the game. So here are some of the ideas that will help mold and fit your music to the particular uses in the game. In the beginning, you start with a large list of tasks that you need to complete and pieces of music that you need to write. And as you write more and more music, you send it off to the client, and they are saying yes or no, and giving you feedback. And there's certainly this revision phase where you go around and around to make sure the music is approved and everybody agrees that this is the correct direction for each piece of music. And then your list of to-do gets smaller and smaller, and your list of, or your folder full of WAV files or music of approved music gets larger and larger and larger. And over time, as the game gets developed, you start plugging holes in the game with music, and you start figuring out which pieces of music fit where. And so some of the different techniques of actually fitting it into the game are certainly some of the ideas that we've used in all of our projects and we've touched on, but certainly want to hit them with more detail. The first one here, of course, is the linear loop. This is the most useful musical technique for games, and is used in lots of different games and lots of different parts of games. And as we talk about things like a linear loop or horizontal resequencing or vertical layering, these are some of the ideas that we'll hit on. They are all just tools in a toolbox, and no game uses just one of them. Well, that's probably not entirely true, because older, more limited games did not have the capabilities of more complex music and were very much reliant on linear loops. But much more modern and larger and complex games require different musical approaches for different parts of the game. Depends on what's going on. So, starting out here with the linear loop, really where music began for games was there was often just one piece of music running as the background all the way through the game, or all the way at least through that level. So, and if it reached the end of that piece of music, then it would just start all over again and play through again. And this is still very, very common in games where sometimes it's not a very complex music system. It's just a long piece of music that is looping in the background. And so a linear loop is typically the entire stereo mix. All of our loops in the game are much, much smaller than what a typical game would use. Really, our game projects are slivers or slices of a much larger game, and the time that people invest in playing these demos is certainly not on the scale of the hours that people put into full games. So our the way we set up our music for our game is really there to highlight your music. So it's a lot of little pieces that switch and change, so you can demonstrate a whole bunch of ideas in less than a minute's time. And but I certainly don't want to give you the sense that music for a much larger game experience is just a whole bunch of 8-bar loops or 16-bar loops or even 32-bar loops. That still is a very small phrase of music that would be very repetitive as it looped if it didn't change a whole lot. So we have much, much smaller scale games and music that switch a whole lot, so it can show off lots of different ideas. Here in the chat, are character motifs used in game music like they are in film composition? Absolutely. This is an idea of depends. Well, let's see. What's the best way of approaching this one? Characters are a idea or concept, just in the same way that a level might be or danger might be. We talked a bit about game states last week, which was what is happening at any one time. And in a film, character motifs work very well because it's not an interactive experience. You are not controlling the action, and it's often very character driven in a film. But in games, they're a bit more action dependent, where it's up to you as the player to pull off all of the actions in the game, and you can tie music to that. So while character motifs are certainly very well used in games, there are also lots of other approaches. But if it is it typically works very well if it is a character that is a very important part of the story, that is often tied to a certain location in the game. I'm thinking about the townspeople, or when you enter a town, or you enter the tavern or the shop, that you will hear and encounter characters in those environments, and they often have character themes. And if it's an important character, then they will often have a character theme, but there's also a lot of unimportant characters that may not have musical themes attached to them. So linear loops are not typically shorter phrases. They are often much larger phrases, like minutes long. And this works well because it allows for a much more fluid composition style, a much more linear composition style, so that the music can flow in a way that is determined by the composer, as opposed to it being interacting with whatever the player is doing. Here in the chat, Timothy, I was thinking of the Uncharted series. This is music was more cinematic than any other game I've played. Uncharted series is a very, very cool series, and it is very much like an interactive movie, much more so than a lot of other games. And Naughty Dog, who makes all of the Uncharted series and The Last of Us and a lot of very, very big, very cool games, are very good at that style. And it is a very linear experience, where there's not many different directions you can go, and there's only certain things that you're going to have to do and very specific actions to continue on in the story, which allows for if you know what's supposed to go on in the game, then you can write music that reacts much more directly to what's supposed to happen. But if there's a lot of complexity and an infinite possibility, then it becomes much more difficult to tie the music together in some cohesive manner. So those are some of the challenges of more linear gameplay versus more open gameplay. So the most important thing about the loop, of course, is the fact that it loops. The fact that when it reaches the end, it has the possibility of tying back to the front, and it does so as invisibly as possible, so that it doesn't cause any sort of pops or clicks or glitches or anything that indicates exactly where you are in the storyline. Often used during times of long exploration, level loops, or puzzle solving. If you don't know how long it's going to take somebody to complete that task, then a loop is going to be very, very useful, because it can just kind of sit there and wait and sit in one place waiting for the player to complete that puzzle or solve the level or whatever they're trying to do. So this can be a challenge, because who knows how long it's going to take. And if you have a 3-minute long piece of music and it's going to take them 10 minutes to explore and figure out what to do next, then excuse me, then you might get quite repetitive. I mean, the player can get very, very lost in a 3-minute long loop, and you are trying to lose them as best as possible. You still need to make it interesting, but you don't want to have anything that identifies that they are repeating over and over again in a loop. So some games, Nintendo games are really good at this, have introduced a board switch. And a board switch is, you don't want the music to get repetitive or boring, so we're going to just fade it out. Legend of Zelda does this quite well, where if you're just wandering around and the music's going to loop, it's looped once and twice and maybe a third or fourth time, then no reason to play it anymore. We'll just fade it out. The player will just hear footsteps and breathing and some ambiences, and then when they no music, and then when they walk into the next piece of action, the music kind of fades in and starts where it needs to, and continues on like it was supposed to do that the entire time. So loops are very, very important, are a skill unto themselves, because you're often taking linear music and finding places for it to loop. If it is very rhythmic, beat-driven music, it becomes a whole lot easier, but if it is much more acoustic, natural, with real human players as opposed to a computer playing everything, creating solid, invisible loops becomes more difficult. So there are certainly different techniques in creating loops, and our assignment from the week one went through some of the editing portions of this. But your composition becomes very, very important, because this is the overall phrasing of your melody and harmony, so that it makes sense within the 8 or 16 bar loop or whatever it is. Don't write a 12 bar phrase and then try to make an 8 bar loop out of it. It's probably not going to work. You need to make sure that whatever point you have reached musically at the end of the cue is able to return back and start all over again at the front. It works very well to start off with the tonic and move your chord progression through the cue so that it can return back and resolve very nicely back to that tonic. May not where you want to be the entire time and always want to start that way, but that's an easy place to start. So whatever happens in your composition, if you have any strong changes of keys or tempo or time signature, wherever you change off to, you have to make sure you return back so that when it loops, you start at the same place. So compositionally is going to be one of your most important techniques. Your choice of instrumentation, if you have much more rhythmic, faster attack, less legato, less sustain, it's going to make things a bit easier overall. If you have things that have a lot of a sustain or decay to them, like orchestral instrumentation, is going to be a bit more difficult than your synthesizers. Fades, there is a possibility of using fades to create a loop, but you want to avoid like completely fading to silence and then fading back in. That becomes very, very obvious. So this idea of fading means that if you build up in intensity and level and volume, then you have to return back down so that it makes a good point to loop at. So if you build up intensity, you can fade things back down and return back to a much more nominal level so that it can swell and build back up again over the couple of minutes and then fall back down. Loops are a bit easier to hide with strongly rhythmic music. If it's a solid 4 on the floor, then it's going to be a lot easier to loop than if it's going to be some atmospheric thing that you lose any sort of tempo. So if you can, often a big kick and a cymbal crash at the beginning can maybe hide or impact at the loop to help that out. Effects, sometimes you can just wash things out in effects and reverbs and delays and hide a loop point in there, hide a transition. It's kind of like what DJs do sometimes when they're getting out of one record. They'll just throw it into a whole bunch of weirdness and effects and then start something else up and maybe even switch keys and tempos and then bring it back in and start at the next point. So some of these are not necessarily making perfect seamless loops. Some of these ideas are just kind of hiding transitions so that you can do whatever you want and it'll still make sense as it loops around. And then, of course, editing. That's what we did with our first assignment, or with our assignment from week 1, where we did things like chop it in half and flip the 2 sides and crossfade the middle to make some non-rhythmic elements loop pretty well. Topping and tailing, finding the beginning of the loop or the downbeat, finding the next downbeat, and finding the beginning and end of a loop to edit it down. This is really what you're probably where you're going to start with all of this stuff. A junior level or assistant level position often takes compositions created by lead composers, and their job is to edit it down into all the little pieces and parts that are needed for a game. So while somebody else is turning away and generating new material, you're going through the library of stuff that already exists and editing it down and fitting it into a game. All right, hold on just a second. Let me take a quick pause here. All right. So, next one here. Stingers and one-shots. Another very commonly used technique beyond just linear loops are, if it's not looping, it's a one-shot, meaning that it only plays once. One-shot is kind of like a larger term than stingers. I would say, I'm not going to say all, but most stingers are one-shots, but not all one-shots are stingers, if that makes any sense, because a one-shot just means it plays through once. A stinger is typically there to provide emphasis on something, to acknowledge that you did something. You did something good or you did something bad. Here's a stinger, right? You got the coin and got 1,000 points. Then here's a little flourish of notes. Or you picked the lock, so the treasure chest opens, and here's a little flourish of sound that represents a stinger. So a stinger is emphasizing, it's an exclamation point on some sort of action in a game. And it can be there sometimes to hide transitions, where this is how we are using it for Angry Bots. We have ambient and action cues, and we have 3 stingers. Those stingers are meant to randomly play when any one of the 3 action cues plays. So that since it's the same buzzer action, mech action, and spider action, since that's the same one each time, you want to have some randomization, some variation in there, so we have one of 3 stingers that could play with any one of those. It's also there to hide the transition. The ambience is at a lower energy level, lower pace, lower intensity, and then all of a sudden the action music needs to drop in. Well, instead of that just being a hard cut and it just transitioning very roughly, it has the possibility of that, then you throw a stinger on top of it to add some emphasis or add some extra layers of interest, and then get it out of the way so that it moves on into the real piece of music. So it can be there to hide something. It can be there to emphasize something. It can be strictly musical or sound design, either one of those, whatever works. A one-shot is a bit more general. One shot could be ambient sounds, like spooky voices in a haunted house, right? So I have 5 ghost voices that randomly play. So every 15 seconds, there's a one shot, and that one shot is going to play randomly one of those 5 sounds, and it just plays once, and then it waits 15 seconds, and then it plays some other random one, then it waits 15 seconds, and then and you can use those to make ambient environments come more to life. Think about like drips in a cave or birds outside, right? You have 10 different bird sounds, and they just fire off randomly, one at a time, to create that environment. It makes it feel like a little bit more immersive. Music can be one-shots. Let's see if that's... puzzles, power-ups, secrets, environments. So power-ups are a good example of this. Power-ups are... you get some sort of ability, or you get extra ammo or extra health or armor or something like that. So you pick up this power up and you are invincible for the next 20 seconds, right? You can go around causing all sorts of havoc while you have this power up. Well, the music will probably change, and you know that it's going to last 20 seconds long. There's no need for it to loop. It's only going to play once. It's like in Super Mario Brothers, right? You know you got the star. You can go and run for a couple of seconds, can go crazy. The music just stops, switches over, plays this faster paced music. It's only going to play through one time, then it switches back and goes to the previous piece of music. So one shots again are more generic. Stingers are a form of one shot, and really it all comes down to the context that it's played in. Game states. I think we hit on game states last week. Yeah, we definitely did that topic, but it's important here because we're going to be talking about horizontal resequencing and vertical layering. So game states are, we said that if you froze the game at any one point in time, any millisecond, every single point in time, and determine what's going on, you can tie your music to that. Games work off of frame rate. The game moves as fast as it can draw something on the screen. So you start the game and it draws the first frame of the game on your screen, and then either 30 times per second or maybe even 60 times per second, it is drawing a new image on your screen. And that's just like animation, is how it creates the sense of movement and the image that you see. Well, so let's say 160 every 60 times a second, it's drawing something on the screen. Well, in between, it draws something on the screen, and you fire your weapon, or you get the high score, or you cross the finish line, or you run the race, or whatever it is. 60 times per second, it's figuring out, okay, where am I? What is my health? What is my score? What is the time left in the game? How much danger am I in? Anything that needs to happen in that game, the game is constantly asking that question 60 times per second. Did I cross the finish line yet? Nope. Did I cross the finish line yet? Nope. Did you cross the finish line? Oh, yes, you did. Okay, well then switch and play cross the finish line music. Did I lose all my health points? No, you're at 100%. Did I lose all my health points? No, now you're at 50. Did I lose all my health points? Nope, at 10. Okay, well, play some low health music at this point. Did I lose all my health points? Yes, you did. Okay, we're going to play death music now. And it's asking a million questions 60 times per second, or however fast the game plays. And whenever that question changes, or the answer is yes or no, or whatever the proper game state is, then you can tie a piece of music to that. That change, whenever something changes in the game, those changes can have a piece of music that is played or hooked to it. So these game states are going to be useful in creating horizontal resequencing or vertical layering, right? Very big words for some pretty standard concepts that we already are familiar with, at least from music side of things. That's just how it's applied to games. So there's a lot of terminology that is kind of interchangeable here. Sometimes you'll hear me say horizontal or vertical orchestration, or horizontal or vertical music system, or horizontal or vertical layering, or resequencing. Or these are all basically the same ideas. There wasn't really the terminology or the definitions of all of these things until much more recently, when the more established and experienced folks in the industry have been doing this for a while and started needing to they wanted to write more about it and write textbooks about it and kind of pass the information of what they've learned on to the next generation of music composers. And they say, well, I've been doing it this way for so long, but let's actually put a word to it, and let's define what we're talking about here. So whenever we say horizontal or vertical anything, what the best way to envision this is to think about a single stereo track in a DAW or a multi-track DAW session, right? Whenever I say horizontal resequencing, you're going to think about a single stereo track in your DAW. On that single stereo track, you can have regions or clips. And those regions are different wave files. They're different pieces of music. Those, whenever you can have one region on a track, or you can have multiple regions on a track. But whenever you play through a single stereo track in a DAW, you are only hearing one piece of music at a time. Now, when we mostly make music in a DAW, we have things like kick, snare, hi-hat, bass guitar, synth, I don't know, vocals, whatever. And it's individual instruments. But if you bounce that out and have a single stereo track, it's the full mix of everything, right? When you bounce out your WAV files, it's everything together. It's everything mixed. So this is the approach that our games from the week 1 and week 2, 2D platformer and Angry Bots, take this approach of horizontal resequencing. So your music is horizontally laid out on one track, and only one piece of music is heard at a time. And what you are doing is shuffling those pieces of music around depending on whatever is happening. Oh, the game started? Okay, here's an ambient piece of music. Okay, well, the robot jumped out and has attacked me. Okay, now we're going to resequence things and we're going to shuffle in or throw out another piece of music. Okay, we defeated that robot. Let's shuffle back to ambient music. And we can move and switch between whatever pieces of music that we want by only playing one at a time. And since it's only one at a time, the full stereo mix is contained in that file. So what we have here, these different colored blocks represent different game states. Different actions, different ideas that can happen in the game. Intro, action, power up, low health, and death. This is somewhat similar to a 2D platformer, where you have an intro piece of music, you have main loops, you have a death piece of music. There were no power-ups. Well, I guess the bomb was kind of a power-up, but we didn't have a piece of music. We had a sound effect for it, but a power-up, so you get invincible for the next 30 seconds. That plays a one piece of 30-second long music. Low health, as long as your health is below 10%, maybe there's some intense piece of music that encourages you to go find, get some more health points. So the intro will probably only play one time. It's like a one-shot. Plays for a couple of bars, and then it immediately transitions over to action. The action can loop around as long as the game is being played until you get a power-up. Then it switches over to the power-up piece of music, and the power-up lasts for 30 seconds, so I can just write a one long 30-second long piece of music. Low health music will loop around as long as the health is low, and if the health points go down to 0, then the death cue plays one time, it's one shot, and plays through to the end, and then it loops back and starts through this whole process all over again. So who knows which one of these is going to play at any one time, and you can just resequence them in any sort of order depending on what you need. The requirements here, though, are each file contains the full stereo mix, so drums, bass, harmony, melody. You only hear one at a time. Maybe the best thing you get is a crossfade, which means it fades from one to the next, but you're really only hearing one at a time. And you have to be able to randomly jump from one cue to the next in any sort of order. The main thing here is that the end of each one of these cues has to be able to jump to the beginning of any one of these cues seamlessly, like it was one whole piece of song, so we could just jump to whichever one that makes sense. So the challenge here is how do you transition? Because while you're playing a piece of music, it's no problem because it's the music and you wrote it in your DAW, and as it's playing, it sounds as you intended, right? There's nothing the computer is really doing to it. It's just playing the WAV file. The challenge and the particular technique here comes in with how do you transition from one cue to the next, right? Being a DJ is not about playing a record. Being a DJ is about how you move from one record to the next, right? While it's playing, you're just sitting there pointing at the crowd dancing. But your challenge of being a DJ is going from record A to record B as smoothly and seamlessly as possible. And so you do things like you match the tempo, you count bars and beats, and you find a suitable position to transition, and you either hard cut it or you, more than likely, you do a smooth crossfade. So those are the same ideas for this system. You can, at the very, very basic, the very simplest setup, when you go from one to the next, all it's going to do is just stop one and move on to the next one. And this is how we've done most of our games so far. If we go from intro to main loop, then it just waited for intro to end, and then it hard cut over to main loop. And it worked because everything was in tempo, and it was meant to be built like that, so that's how you made your music. When you go from ambient to action, action just hard cuts. It just drops right in, stops ambient, moves right over. It works really well because the robot's jumping out at you, and you just get thrown into battle, and it's very, very different. The death cue, same sort of way. It's a very sudden, hard change in the game, where when you're the little bean, and you lose all your health points, the music immediately switches. You lose control of the game, and it works with a sudden transition. So you either have to wait through the entire queue so that it drops on beat, or it's going to hard cut and you're not guaranteed at all where that's going to be. And so a lot of times musically, that's just going to be bad. It's going to be somewhere in the middle of a beat and somewhere in the middle of a rhythm, and it's just not going to make much sense. So that becomes a challenge because this is still the very simplest level. My two options are I have to wait for it. I have to wait for a bar or 2 bars or 4 bars or however long for it to musically make sense, or I have to hard cut it and hope and pray that it makes some sort of sense and I get lucky when I transition, and that's not a good way of doing it. So you have to make it a bit more complex. If you don't like those options, then you have to introduce a more complex music system to your game, and you have to have it set up so that it operates more like how a DJ would resequence a piece of music, where it starts. You have to have the computer start counting bars and beats. It has to understand what tempo you're in, what time signature you're in, and the number of bars and beats that it needs to wait. But if the game can start counting bars and beats, and which is very easy, it's just a clock and it just counts and it knows exactly where you are as long as you tell it everything. Then you can say, okay, well, if I am 3 bars into this, wait 1 more bar so I can transition on that 4th bar. Or, hey, I only have to wait 1 more bar or 2 bars, and then I can smoothly, a bit more fluently transition from one to the next. So it can be a challenge, but for some games it works very well. Often used in action games, puzzle games, casual games, kids games. If you know what's going to happen, and especially if the player has to do A, B, and C to get to point D, and then go to X, Y, and Z, and then you know exactly what the linear path is that they have to follow, then it's almost like breadcrumbs. And you're like, oh, here, you reached to here. Here's a new piece of music. Congratulations. Oh, you did that thing? Here's another piece of music. Oh, you screwed up. Here's a bad piece of music. And so you can just kind of feed them as they go, if you have a better idea of what's happening. So each queue uses multiple themes. Everything is fully mixed, and everything needs to replace the one before. So you're shuffling, you are resequencing, and you have to make sure that everything can tie together, because you have no clue which one is the next one that's going to play. Oh, excuse me. Pardon me. So, horizontal resequencing will work better if you know what's going to come up. But if you have less of an idea of what's going to happen and when it's going to happen, and have any hope if it's going to happen at some musical point, then maybe a horizontal setup is less than optimal. If you have to wait around, or if you want to be able to switch to a new piece of music at the moment's notice and have everything be in sync and stay in time and have multiple layers of music work together as opposed to just one at a time, then a vertical musical or a vertical layered approach will work a bit better. So, actually, let me take another quick pause here before I get into this topic. Hold on just a sec. All right, so we said that when picturing a when picturing a horizontal music system, we said um, think about or picture a single stereo track in your DAW. Where only one thing is playing at a time, and if you're only hearing one thing, then it's the complete stereo mix of everything. Well, instead of that, when picturing a vertical music system, now we're going to imagine a multi-track DAW session where you have multiple tracks, multiple layers stacked on top of each other vertically, playing at the same time. And this is the way we are most comfortable with making music, right? This is what you do in your DAW. This is how you create music. You start with drums, kick, snare, hi-hat, then you move to bass lines, and then you move to harmonic instruments, or maybe, I don't know, guitars and strings and horns and keys, and then you move on to lead instruments, and you are building up track by track. And all of those tracks or layers are vertically arranged, stacked on top of each other, so that when you play them together, they create one whole piece of music. You can mute and solo each of those individual tracks and listen to just the bass line or just the drums or individual elements. And they still make sense because the individual parts make sense when played together, and when everything's unmuted, the whole thing plays together, and it still makes sense because everything is part of the same song. It's in the same key, it's in the same tempo, same time signature. It starts at the same time and it ends at the same time, and it is one whole song. So this is how we can approach our music for a vertical layering music system, where instead of tracks or layers being individual instruments, it's actually groups of instruments that represent different emotional themes in the game or different intensity levels in the game. So, a vertical music system works very well in building up layers of complexity and tension to a peak and then releasing them back down. There's a great video this week in the suggested viewing from Red Dead Redemption, which is a game by Rockstar Games, it's set in the Old West, and great musical score. And they describe the process when working with their instrumentalists, that they had everybody work in A minor at 130 beats per minute. And so if every layer, if every instrument, every track was written to this requirement, then you know that when you combine them all together, it's always going to make sense. You could go to the relative major, you could go from 130 beats per minute, which is a much more faster pace, down to 65, which is much more of a cowboy slow saunter kind of pace, and everything always fits together. So what you are doing is you are utilizing one ongoing piece of music. The music starts at the same time, it ends at the same time, and it all loops together. All of the layers play together. It's just most of them are muted until they are needed. And whenever it's muted or unmuted, then a new layer is introduced, a new element is introduced. And since they all start together and all end and loop together and they're at the same tempo, then they're all going to make musical sense. You don't want anything to clash harmonically or melodically. Keep them all in the same key. You don't want to have anything clash rhythmically. So you keep it in the same tempo. Everything follows the same core or foundation structure so that it all fits well when pieced together. This is the puzzle aspect of it, where you have to make sure that all of the layers fit together. Each new layer is faded in on top of the other, so with each new layer introduced, it has to work with all of the other previous layers. This is typically broken down into, sometimes you have a low, medium, and high intensity music, so maybe 3 or 4 layers, maybe 6 or 8 layers gets a lot, and probably no more than 10 layers of music to have a whole bunch of stuff and a whole bunch of options, because you can combine them together in any sort of way. So what we have here is different game states that has the music build up and down depending on what's going on. Often used in open world games, this works a whole lot better if you have less of an idea of what's going to happen. If you, with the Red Dead Redemption, the Old West kind of game, you could jump on a horse at any time. Well, when they jump on a horse, you want to introduce a new musical layer, and so it's got that kind of galloping or trot kind of feel to it. And so it has to work with whatever music was playing already. So it's just an extra layer that gets faded in on top, and it was always there, just you couldn't hear it. Excuse me again. Also works very, very well in horror games, because a vertical music system works well in building up intensity or tension. You add new layers and build things to a peak, and then break them back down again to return back to where you were. So we have ambient, proximity, close, action, and cooldown. These are 5 different game states. These are very familiar to a horror game. If you have, you start out with an ambient layer, and this is, the player is safe at this point, whether they know it or not. They're just creeping around, exploring through the level. There is a kind of a bottom or base layer of music or sound that represents this ambient layer. Then the monster is out there. Again, maybe the player knows it or not, but there's something out there so that the music shifts a little bit. Maybe it gets a bit more ominous overall. Still, whatever new layer is introduced, it has to work with whatever was continuously and still playing below it. Then you're close. You're right around the corner, or you're hiding from the monster. Again, maybe you know it or not. Maybe you're right there and you're hiding, trying to make sure that the monster doesn't notice you, or the monster is crouched ready to attack. You don't know, and it's right there. And this is when the music is building to its peak. You're trying to hit that that point, the highest point of tension, right before everything breaks loose. So then you've got the action stage, right? Horror games are really good at that jump scare where the monster jumps out of nowhere and freaks everybody out, and the music switches to action. All right, so this is where the full instrumentation, the full rhythm, everything is pounding away. This is where you have your full mix, and all of these new layers have to introduce and work with all of the previous layers. Then you are fighting and battling with the monster. You either get away, either defeat the monster, or at least you get away far enough to run off and hide again. And then you have a cooldown phase. You can't just immediately mute and cut all of these off. You have to have a period of time where you're returning back to your normal pace. It's like your heart rate. When the monster jumps out, your heart rate skyrockets very quickly, very easily. But when you finally find safety, you don't immediately just like return and be like, oh, that's cool. You breathe heavy and you calm down. Your heart rate just kind of returns back to normal slowly over time. So you have this cool down phase before it all starts all over again, and it builds it up, right back up, and then falls right back down. So very common technique. Vertical music system is much more prevalent in newer modern games where the gaming system has the ability of playing multiple files at the same time. You have to play multiple layers and keep them all in sync. So it's typically a newer technique in gaming. I think I said most of this stuff. Utilizes one long ongoing loop. Everything has to stay in the same key and tempo to make sure everything works just fine together. There are a couple of different approaches for vertical layering, just two ideas here. There is additive layering and there is interchange. Additive layering means that every new layer plays with all of the previous layers. So you start out, you hear ambient, then you hear ambient and proximity, then you hear ambient, proximity, and close, then you hear ambient, proximity, close, and action, and then it goes up and then it builds back down. So every new layer plays with all the other previous layers. It adds one layer at a time. So that first bed is going to be playing all the time through everything. Interchange means that it doesn't always rely on one of these. It doesn't have to always go up and then return back down. It can just use any combination of the 5 or 10 wave files. This will give you the most randomness. This is how our Palace game is an interchange music system, where the player can go off and turn on any of the 4 pieces of music at any time, and have one playing at a time, any 2 playing at a time, any of the 3 playing at a time, or all 4. So it gives you way more combinations overall. There's not a foundation that's always played, but it can certainly work for different types of systems. So really all depends on what is needed. Really, the most modern games use vertical layering at some points. We'll use horizontal resequencing at some points. We'll use linear loops at some point. And it all just depends on what's going on. And we'll sometimes switch between them very quickly and very invisibly to the player. So you aren't really too sure. If it's a cutscene or a cinematic where it's just like a movie, then it's a linear loop, or doesn't even loop. It's just like a one-shot piece of music that plays for 3 minutes while you watch the movie. So it all depends on what is needed. We talked about the idea of a top-down approach when we were discussing our composition for the Palace game. We said a top-down approach is thinking about the overall composition first before we think about the details of the instruments or the formatting or the looping, or you think about the composition itself and then assign the correct notes to the correct instruments. So a top-down approach is, instead of building up one layer at a time, I'm going to write a French horn line, and now I'm going to write a cello line, now I'm going to write a viola line, and just build up one by one. You write chord progression, you write a series of melodies, you figure out the composition, the notes first, and then you determine and build out your structure for the proper instruments. One of the worst sins of a vertical music system, one of the biggest troubles or issues, is dissonance or clashing notes. If you don't keep things in the same key, it's going to sound like a complete mess when all put together. So the notes themselves, the composition, is the most important aspect of this. That is the puzzle aspect. If everything fits together in that puzzle, then whatever instrument you choose should work. I mean, that's not completely true. I mean, there's a lot of consideration in your instrumentation, but the composition will allow any combination of instruments to work well. All right, so like I said, games, more modern games, use more of a combination of linear loops, horizontal resequencing, and vertical layering. But definitely important concepts. It applies to our games this month. And most games out there can be broken down to those different categories of how they work. It is important to know that every game is different. The need for the music and the complexity of the setup of how it's going to play is different. I mean, our game projects this month are built and based off of the general concepts that are quite common, like intros, loops, and endings. You can call it what you want, but that's a very similar concept in lots of different games. The idea of ambient in action may not be called that, but it might be called exploration and battle or something like that, where it's something that's lower in intensity and then higher intensity while you are engaged in the action in the game. So different games will use different setups, but as you work on multiple different types of games, then you can certainly see common approaches for all of them, right? Same thing goes with music. You can record a whole bunch of different bands, but there's certain fundamental ideas that you can rely on in any sort of process. All right. That will wrap it up for the building the music for the game, or at least some of the techniques or approaches for that. Our next topic here will get us more into the technology side of things. As we get into the second half of the month, or our Thursday night sessions, we have our one for week 3 and week 4. We'll be talking a bit more about what happens to your music to actually get it in the game. And we are going to start out here with some of the realities of the technology, and then we will round it out with a review of the history of audio for gaming consoles. So that we're going to talk about the Nintendo and the Super Nintendo and the Genesis and Dreamcast and GameCube and PlayStation 2, 3, and 4, and all of the different generations of game consoles, and talk about their capabilities. Because when we get into the technology and what is possible now, it seems some aspects will seem like there's lots of possibilities. Some aspects might feel like there's more limited resources overall. But to really get a sense of what is possible now, we're going to look back over some of the history and what was possible in previous generations for games. All right, so let's go ahead and hit on some of these ideas of limited resources, because this is one of the biggest. Let's say this. It can become one of the bigger challenges when working with music for a game. Because when working in a music studio, when working at your home studio or working on your computer, our computers are becoming very powerful. Even our laptops have a lot of RAM. You probably have 4 or 8 or maybe 16 or even more gigs of RAM in your computer. For music, you have terabytes worth of hard drive space. You've got fast computer processors. So, we can still load up Logic and Pro Tools and still make them cry and have a lot of things going on in our session. But we don't flinch too much anymore when we have large file sizes and large RAM requirements and need fast computers for a lot of plugins. It always is getting better and better as the technology moves forward. So what often happens in games is you send off the music to the client, and you have music as 24-bit 96K. It's 5.1 surround sound and or even stereo. But you send it off to the client, and you're like, "Look at this music. Where is it? Look at this music. It's this big. It's huge. It's awesome. It sounds amazing. Look how awesome this music is." And they go, "Wow, that's great. That's the best awesome music I've ever heard. It's so big. That's great. We want this in our game, but make it like this big. You got to fit it into a file size that's only this big." So and then you go back to your studio and you cry a little bit because they're going to totally reduce the audio quality, and they're going to cut it down and hack it down to make it fit in that space, and it's going to sound like a shell of its former self. But these are some of the realities with music for video games, is that we do not have unlimited space. We do not have unlimited resources. We have to make sure our music fits within the game disc or the download or whatever it is. And we have some of the problems because as musicians, as composers, our music is some of the biggest, fattest files on the game disc. Because it is pre-rendered music. Music or sound, a very good guideline to go by is 16-bit 44.1K CD quality audio is 5 megabytes per mono minute of music or of sound. So that's uncompressed. 5 minutes per 5 megabytes per mono minute of music. So 10 megabytes for stereo music. That's a lot of megabytes very, very quickly, right? We bounce out the file. It's not all that much. It doesn't matter. But in a game, when you only have 5 gigabytes to put the entire game on for a DVD, or you want your game to be an iOS game and you need it to be the whole game to be below 100 megabytes or 10 megabytes, then all of a sudden your big fat music files become a problem. So we're going to talk about the limitations. We have limitations in RAM. We have limitations in hard drive space. We have limitations in processing power. And we have limitations in audio playback. So these are some of the realities that we face working on music, because it's certainly different than like if you're making music for an album. You make the music as high as quality as you can. It doesn't matter how big it is, because it's all going to be bounced down into one file and put on a disk or downloaded, and it'll be fine. Same thing goes with the movie. It's going to be a 2 hour long movie, and it's going to fit on the DVD, but the video is probably even bigger than the music or the sound. So that can not be so much of an issue. But with games, a lot of the graphics for the games are rendered while the game is being played. So there's not hours worth of video for the game. It's all being generated in real time. It's kind of like the difference between MIDI and WAV files. WAV files are really large because they are the pre-rendered music. MIDI files are really small because it's telling some synthesizer how to play that music. So we have to get our files out of the way for the rest of the game. So let's hit our first point here. Limited RAM. Your audio needs to be stored in RAM to be instantly accessible. If you want to hear that sound immediately as soon as you hit the button, it needs to be in RAM. When you pull the trigger on the controller, you need to hear that gunshot. It needs to happen immediately. When you press the button and you hear the jump sound, it needs to be playing immediately. Those sounds need to be loaded into RAM. So a lot of sound effects are loaded into RAM so that they're played immediately. Music can often fluctuate a little bit and doesn't necessarily need to be played frame accurate every single time. If it's a little bit off, and I mean we're talking just milliseconds for the game to catch up, then maybe it doesn't need to be in RAM. It can stream it off the disk or buffer it somehow, and that's what happens a lot of times, is that the music is playing off of a separate file somewhere and being streamed into the game. Excuse me. Whenever you see in a game, whenever you see when it stops for a moment, it says loading, then it's unloading all of the old stuff out of RAM and loading up all of the new stuff. So you have this constant battle of size versus quality, which is, I want the quality of my music to be as high as possible. Well, higher quality music is a bigger file size. Well, you can't fit that much stuff into RAM at any one point. We're familiar with RAM from Kontakt and samplers. You can't load up an infinite amount of Kontakt instruments, or else you'll run out of RAM. Same thing goes with games. They can't load up an infinite amount of sounds for a game, or else it'll run out of RAM, and you won't have that sound ready to play. So you have this thing called a memory footprint, which is the amount of RAM necessary for all audio at a current point in the game. So if I go into a new level, it unloads all the old sounds and loads in all of the new sounds. And that the amount of RAM that I need for that level is its memory footprint. You want your footprint to be as small as possible, but that's not always a reality. So that depends on the need. Sometimes a lot of these more technical aspects, you don't, it's not necessarily your job to make this all fit. Your job can often be delivering the 24-bit 96K files, and then they'll squash it down however they need to make it fit on the disk. So, but it is something that is to be considered, that you don't have unlimited space. If you're writing music for a mobile game, then that completely changes the equation. Here in the chat, Timothy, don't the new generations of consoles have much more space for larger audio files, though? Yes, absolutely. They went from RAM, from the PlayStation 3 was a half a gigabyte, 512 megabytes on a PlayStation 3, to 8 gigabytes on a PlayStation 4. So that's 16 times the amount of RAM. And talking to the guys at EA Sports, I think it's 2016. Well, they probably did it in, they're just releasing 2016 now. They probably started in 2014, 2015, where they had all of this new space. And so I mean, the amount of new stuff that they're recording to fill in all of this space is absolutely amazing. So it is a huge change. But what's going to happen is we're just going to fill it up with more stuff, and a couple of years from now, it's going to feel like a small amount of space again, right? Just like in the 15 years ago when the PlayStation 3 came out. Man, that's a long time ago. No, PlayStation 3 came out in 2009. PlayStation 2 came out in 2000. I think PlayStation 3 came out in 2009, where a half a gigabyte was a lot of RAM. So we'll just fill it up overall. Limited disk space, right? This is the other reality here. Back in the day, we're like, oh, we'll never fill up more than a couple of megabytes on a cartridge. I read somewhere that if you took one instance of every Nintendo game, there are like 300 Nintendo games out there or something like that. If you took one instance of them, it would, the entire game, put them all together, it's like less than 300 megabytes when all put together. So they're very small. And everything at that point had to be synthesized in real time. There was no recorded WAV files. Then we went to 650 megabytes on a CD. Then we went to 4.9 gigabytes on a Blu-ray disc. On a DVD. And now we're at 50 gigabytes on a Blu-ray disc. And then if you download stuff, it can be... I mean, games can easily be 30 or 50 gigabytes downloading. So, again, we will always fill up this space. But you have to make sure that your files fit within the allotted amount of space that's available. The story goes from Halo 3, when all of the audio was created for Halo 3, all of the music, sound effects, and dialogue, it weighed in at 9 gigabytes. Halo 3 came out on a DVD that was 4.9 gigabytes. So just the audio of the game was twice as large as the game should be, right? So that left no room for any of the actual game. So Halo is an Xbox exclusive title. Xbox has a compression format called XMA, which is part of the Xbox. And it's kind of like MP3 or OGG files or something, where I think it goes up to a 20-to-1 ratio of file size, file compression. They used a 10-to-1 file compression ratio on their 9 gigabytes of files. So they went down from 9 gigabytes down to 1 gigabyte. And then you had 3 gigabytes left over for the rest of the game. So that allowed the audio and everything to fit on the game disc. But again, if you are doing an iOS game or an Android game, file size is a big requirement or limitation. So you have to make sure that your music is going to fit within that space. And then our last limitation here is, well, I guess I should throw in there that there's also limited CPU power, right? The computers are only fast enough, so fast to process anything. Well, music doesn't take up a lot of processing power because it's just a WAV file and it's playing back the WAV file. All of the complexity happened in the actual DAW. Processing power for games is mostly the graphics and the rendering. It's rendering the images on screen. Sometimes with audio you get real-time effects, plugins, and so that will take up some processing power, just like a Space Designer or something like that. But just strictly playing the music has less effect on the processing power as a whole. Limited audio system. We would love to think that everybody is playing our games on some massive home theater setup or playing through some awesome monitor speakers. But the reality is, people are playing their games on their TV speakers or through the little crappy speakers that you get when you first buy your computer, or headphones or earbuds or something like that. And the reality is that maybe your game, your music is never going to be heard better than your studio, which is not necessarily bad, because you want your studio to sound really good and better than anything else, so that you know what the peak of the quality is. But you also have to mix and realize that the reality of everybody's system. Games have a lot less specifications and standards in the industry than movies, where movies have things like Dolby and DTS and all sorts of standards of how the audio should play back. Sony has a different standard than Microsoft, which has a different standard than Nintendo, and so this can cause some issues with consistency across the board. Plus, again, people are actually playing your games on much, much smaller systems, and so there's a much of a wider variety. But games can actually change in real time. I was playing the new Battlefront game, which is the new Star Wars game, and it's done by DICE, which has one of the best audio teams in the world, and the game sounds absolutely amazing. And the game can actually switch from mono to stereo to 5.1 in real time, and all you have to do is go to the menu and switch it. There's also a dynamic range in the game, an option where you can say squash it or have very wide dynamic range, which will affect the mix in real time. So all of these things can make up for the fact that people are playing their games on less than optimal listening environments. All right, so our last topic for this evening. History of audio for gaming consoles. This is our trip down memory lane of games and their audio and their music and what the capability was through the different decades, through the different generations of gaming consoles. So I always like to, if you guys post up in the chat if you owned any of these systems or some of your favorite games or classic memories of music in any one of these games. Of course, we're going to start out here with Nintendo. We could go back a little bit further, certainly through Atari and ColecoVision and some of the earliest systems. But we'll start here with Nintendo because it kind of represents kind of the last of that era where everything was generated in real time through synths. But I find most people either have played a Nintendo at some point, whether it is they either had the original Nintendo or somebody in their neighborhood had one, or their family or whatever. And people have more experience with some of these earlier systems, and then as real life sets in, and certainly this the degree program and the rest of life, maybe you've moved a bit farther and farther from playing games. Maybe you're writing music all the time and whatever it is. But hold on, let me take another quick pause. What do we got here? We got the Wii, Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64, PC gaming, PlayStation, Xbox. Nice. All sorts of good stuff. So you'll understand my references. All right, hold on. All right. So, starting out with a Nintendo, think about all those classic melodies that you may remember. I always think that I know there's a lot more important things that I should remember in my life, but for some reason I will always remember the melody. Well, certainly Super Mario Brothers and Legend of Zelda and Metroid. Timothy, what does PCM stand for? PCM stands for Pulse Code Modulation. We'll talk about what that channel does here. So, all of those classic melodies were done with 4 simple waveforms and the PCM channel. Those simple waveforms were 2 pulse waves. Those are like square waves, where they could change the length of the square wave or the duty cycle. So 2 square waves or 2 pulse waves, a triangle wave. Those were often used for bass tones, harmonies. 1 noise channel, white noise, typically was used for percussion. And the PCM channel, pulse code modulation, is basically you could draw your own repeating waveform. So you could draw your own wave shape and use that. So it could be used for sound effects. It could be used for percussion or another lead channel or whatever it is. So, and these total of 5 waveform channels were music and sound effects. So if a sound effect needed to happen, some instrument channel needed to drop out, or they would just use 4 out of the 5 of them and use the 5th one for sound effects, or whatever it was. So, in Mario, if you get the fireball and you start throwing fireballs, the bass drops out, or one of the elements drops out while you throw the fireballs. And all of the sound effects in Mario Brothers are timed to the music. All of the music is at the same tempo. All of the sound effects and the running is all timed together. So when you jump, an element drops out, and when you land, it comes back in, and it all stays on beat musically. So, and it could do this because it was writing the music as it goes. Or, I mean, it was already written, but it was playing it as it goes, or generating it as it goes. So, Super Nintendo comes out around Christmas of 1984. Super Nintendo comes around 1989, 1990. So, 4 or 5 years later, you all of a sudden get switched to sampled sound effects. You could do very, very limited recorded audio, and you could still generate music in real time, or use the internal waveforms. So you could have 8 times 16-bit 32K voices. So you could play up to 8 sounds simultaneously. Could be up to 16-bit 32K, but that's really high quality, and it would use up a whole bunch of file size. Everything still was down at 11K and 8-bit or 4-bit or something very much lower. And a lot of sounds were still being generated in real time. Everything based off of the cartridge. Of course, there was the big competitor to Nintendo was Sega. I was absolutely amazed when I got my Sega Genesis and I turned it on and it said Sega, and it actually talked to me. I thought that was crazy. 32 kilobytes worth of RAM. That's for everything. So think about a full Sonic the Hedgehog level. All of the audio was occupied only 32 kilobytes worth of RAM. So those were the coin sounds, the jumping, the turbo mode, and the all the enemies. It still had 6 FM voices on a Yamaha sound chip. This was the mid-'80s. Yamaha was doing the DX7 synthesizer, very, very popular with the in the 80s. And so Sega licensed the FM synthesis technology from Yamaha, And so you got a lot higher quality sounds and music from the Sega very, very quickly. Sega was also one of the first to do stereo outputs. It was only out of this headphone jack at the front. They didn't really use it all that much, but it was possible. And a little while later, the Sega Saturn comes around. This is one of the first CD-based technologies, which means there was a whole bunch of room for new material. Wasn't as well received in the States overall, but it's had some pretty impressive technology. 16 channels, simultaneous sounds. This time is 8 channels of FM synthesis, so you just got more complex setup. Then we get to the mid-90s, Nintendo 64 and the Sony PlayStation. Oh my goodness. The great story between these was that originally Nintendo licensed the CD technology for their next gaming system. So they were working together to create... so they licensed the CD technology from Sony, and so they were going to have Sony build them their next gaming console. And it was in prototype stages, it was known as the PlayStation, the Nintendo PlayStation. And there was a licensing restrictions and licensing battle between Nintendo and Sony. It was actually going to do cartridges and disc-based CD technology. So the licensing issues were that Nintendo was going to retain all the rights and all the money from all the cartridge games, and Sony put in the deal that they were going to retain all of the rights and money for all the CD games. Well, Nintendo didn't like that so much because there was a possibility at that time that technology would move to the CD discs, and they would lose out on a whole bunch of money. And so they stopped that partnership. They left Sony with a almost completely working game system, and Nintendo went off to finish off and make the Nintendo 64. So Sony was left with like I said, a fully working gaming system. So they said, well, screw it, we're going to release it on our own. And they released the Sony PlayStation and completely changed the gaming industry. There certainly, if it didn't come down to contracts and licensing issues, there could be a Nintendo PlayStation out there. But technology took a big jump. The Nintendo had up to 100 channels of audio, but each channel took 1% of CPU, so you couldn't actually do 100 channels, or else you'd have no game. It would just be music. 100 channels of music. Could do 16-bit 48K audio, but you only had 4 megabytes on the cartridge, and so you couldn't really do a whole bunch of high-quality audio. It was one of the first systems that was capable of doing MP3s. But Sony PlayStation comes along with a CD-based technology and very much changes the industry. Very much changes Sony. Sony beforehand was a big media company, record and movies, personal electronics, home electronics, TVs, radio, stereo systems. Nowadays, Sony is still the media side of things, has almost completely given up on electronics division and mostly staying afloat with the PlayStation. I mean, it's absolutely a huge part of their business now. 24 channels of 44K, 44.1 kilohertz audio, CD quality sound streaming from the disc. Now, all of a sudden, we go away from synthesized music to recorded soundtracks. With now you all of a sudden get a punk rock soundtrack in Tony Hawk or Crazy Taxi, or you get full orchestral music in God of War, and it was a huge change. They Also, remember the Sony PlayStation had those black disc based discs where it was just streaming the music. The game was track 1, and the music and the soundtrack was track 2 through 99. So if you could put your own music disc and play it through the PlayStation, or you could take your PlayStation games and sometimes you could play them on your Sony CD player. So lots of technology happening in a big change. Sega comes out with their Dreamcast, a very popular system. Well, actually, no, that's not entirely true. Very powerful system. Lots of cool technology. Kind of sunk Sega. Probably wasn't as big of a seller or big profit return. They gave up on hardware consoles and went just software after that. But now we've pretty much reached the quality standard. We've hit CD quality, 16-bit 44.1. It's recorded audio. It's full soundtracks. Now it's about, we hit quality. Now we want to do quantity. Now it's about how many sounds can we play, and how much complexity and density can we put into our mix. So 64 channels of audio. Now we went up to 2 megabytes for RAM. Right. This is a big jump. But, and this is where we were for many, many years with the audio. PlayStation 2 comes around and was an absolute beast in the industry of technology and power. PlayStation 2 kind of set the watermark for how long these game systems they would hope to last. Like we said, the PlayStation 2 comes out in like 1999, 2000, and they stopped making them in 2012. And the last game that was still made for PlayStation 2 was FIFA 2014. So 14 years later, they were still making games for the PS2, or making one game for it. Which is a huge amount of time in technology terms, right? Every year there's new technology. Every 3 to 5 years it's almost completely changed. 10 years in the industry is ancient. So the PlayStation 2, the reason why it was so popular was after you sold your PlayStation 2 back to GameStop or some other location, they turned around and those PlayStation 2s went all across the world to different markets that didn't have access to the newest and latest technology. And what do folks like all across the world to play? They want to play FIFA. They want to play football or soccer. So it makes a whole lot of sense as to why that is still around and it can still be quite popular overall. But we went to 48 channels of audio, 48 kilohertz of audio. Again, we're at the full quality standard. 2 megabytes worth of RAM for all of the audio, which is still absolutely amazing that they could fit all of that stuff. We went to DVD storage. We moved from CDs to DVDs. So we went to almost 5 gigabytes worth of storage space. The games got a lot more, a lot bigger, a lot more complex, a lot more creative and beautiful and all that sort of stuff. The lot more modern gaming era. GameCube, so Nintendo finally gets on the disc-based technology, but it was those little small half kind of disc size. At this point, Nintendo is not really known for its technology. Like, it's not got the best graphics ever. Nintendo is really good at making Nintendo games. You know, if you're going to get a Nintendo, you're going to get an awesome Mario game and an awesome Zelda game and Pokemon and all those. But it's pushing more of the experience of playing games than the technology itself. So if you're just focused on the technology side, which is what we're talking about, it's a little lacking overall compared to the other ones. 64 channels, 16-bit 48K audio, Dolby Pro Logic 2 surround. It wasn't 5.1 surround sound yet. This was surround sound off of like what VHS tapes would kind of, I don't want to say fake, kind of fake surround sound. Microsoft gets into the home console market. Microsoft had been doing games forever on Windows, and they took over your office, they took over your computer. Now they want to take over your living room. So I would consider Xbox one of the first, and kind of PlayStation 2 also, but the first full home entertainment system where, yes, it can play games, but it connects to the internet, it plays movies, it plays your music, it talks to friends online, and all that sort of stuff. So 64 channels of 3D positioned audio, 256 stereo voices. It could do a lot more with 3D positioning and panning to give them, like, games were starting to be much more 3D at that point, much more immersive. Still at 2 megabytes worth of RAM. Dolby Digital 5.1 in game. The PlayStation couldn't do surround sound in game at that point. Nintendo Wii. Nintendo comes along and really changes the game and game consoles with motion gaming. The big thing with the Wii is that anybody, your kid and your grandmother could all play the Wii because it had this new way of controlling where you're actually moving around and swinging the controller around. So wasn't a huge change in the audio. It did have a cool extra speaker on the controller, so you could do separate outputs and separate mixes. 64 channels of audio, 16-bit 48K. It's pretty much what it was on the GameCube. 64 megabytes, total of 88 megabytes for all of the RAM. Not tons. You get about 10% for audio, so about 6 to maybe 10 megabytes for audio. The Sony PlayStation 3, actually the Wii, PlayStation 3, and the Xbox 360 are still the most popular game consoles, the most out there, because not everybody has switched over to Xbox 360 or Xbox One or PlayStation 4, including me. I still haven't played my PlayStation 3. I'm trying to convince Full Sail to buy me a PlayStation 4. Hasn't been very successful yet, but I keep asking. Not by me. No, not me. My class. I need it for demonstration purposes. It's very important. PlayStation 3, a very powerful gaming console. 512 audio channels. You don't really want to hear 512 sounds at the same time, right? It's way too much. But if you get into 5.1 surround sound and you take that 512 and you divide it by 6, then all of a sudden you get much more reasonable numbers, and just everything's in surround sound. 256, a total of 512 megabytes, right? We went from 2 megabytes of RAM for audio to 512 megabytes of RAM for everything for the PlayStation 3. It was a big jump, lots more room. So like I said, you went about 10%. So let's say you get about 20 to 25 megabytes of RAM for audio. So that's like 10 times the amount of space. It's a lot of room. Then we went to Blu-ray game discs. All of a sudden the games could be massive because they went from 5 gigabytes to 50 gigabytes. Xbox 360, very comparable to the PlayStation 3. And still is. 256 audio channels, 5.1 audio playback, 512 megabytes, 4.9 DVDs. Wasn't Blu-ray at that point, it was DVDs. But still very, very similar. And then, as of, 2 Christmases ago, well, I think the Wii was even before that, but the Wii U really didn't change much for the audio from the Wii. You do get this separate screen and a separate interface, and you can have your own headphones and have a completely separate mix than what's coming out of the main system, which is kind of cool. So somebody using this can hear something very different than everybody else. 6-channel LPCM, so that's linear pulse code modulation. That's not Dolby or AC3 or anything. It's just 6 individual channels for surround sound. You have to have a special, not a special, but you have to make sure your home surround sound system plays back in this format. But not too much difference. 2 gigabytes worth of RAM for everything. PlayStation 4. Not too much known about the audio specifically. We know the specs. It's got a Blu-ray disc. It's got an 8 gigabytes worth of memory. So like I said, we went from 512 to 8 gigabytes. A half a gigabyte to 8 gigabytes, 16 times the amount of RAM for everything. So it'll be interesting to see where the games take all of this stuff. The actual chip inside of the PlayStation is an AMD True Audio chip. It allows you to do onboard processing of audio separate from the main computer. So it's not taking up any extra RAM. No, it's not taking up any extra processing power from the main game. It has its own dedicated processor for effects and audio. Xbox One's very similar. It does do some cool stuff with the Kinect and voice activation and voice recognition. So you can kind of talk to your Xbox. 8 gigabyte worth of RAM, 50 gigabyte Blu-ray disc, Dolby DTS 7.1. By the time you get to PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, Xbox 360, Xbox One, we've pretty much hit quality. We've hit quantity because it's got so many channels of audio playing simultaneously and so much RAM. Now it's all about what can you do with it creatively. If you've got all these resources, how can you make it more interactive? How can you make it more reactive to what the player is doing and make it more immersive overall? They're just having so much more room to record a whole bunch of stuff. Like, for example, with the crowd noises in stadiums in a sports game, as opposed to having a couple of different layers that they could build for stadiums, they can actually go around to each stadium and record it and have it specific for that game. More characters and more voices and just all sorts of stuff. There's just, with each new system, there's a whole bunch of new possibilities. So, all right, that is everything from me for this evening. I think that should wrap it up for tonight. If you have any questions, go ahead and post it up. I'll stick around for a few minutes afterwards. But revisions are open for week 2, and your new round of assignments are due Sunday for week 3. If you have any questions, please get in contact with me, and we can discuss that. But if not, then I will see you again on Tuesday. All right? Have a good evening, everyone. Have a good weekend.